The 90s were an odd time for masculinity. Once the hair dye and acid-wash genes of 80s glam rock died, the charts became littered with posturing male bravado and heterocentrism at a time when Britpop and nu metal ruled the industry. So when 1997 rolled around and we saw the emergence of an alt-rock band with a frontman who cross-dressed, sang honestly about his relationships with men and women, and formed a band that fostered an inclusive approach to identity with their fans, Placebo's Brian Molko was one of the defining queer icons of the 90s and beyond. Placebo formed in central London in 1994, and the founding members were bassist Stefan Alsdahl and frontman Brian Molko, who went to school together in Luxembourg but never spoke until after. The band took inspiration from post-punk and no-wave bands like Sonic Youth and Depeche Mode, and frequently refrained from using labels in their songs about sexual relationships and gender identity. Their breakthrough single was Nancy Boy, which is a disparaging way of describing overtly effeminate or gay men. The label obviously has a negative connotation to it, and the lyrics tackle a queer man's sexual exploits through the negative views conservative bigots have about bisexuality. Popular stereotypes about being bisexual are that bisexuals just can't make up their mind or that they're greedy and promiscuous. Brian took this label and turned the song into an ode to hedonism, making it a reclamation of sexual promiscuity, which he wore as a badge of honor, with lyrics that went, "Cruising for a piece of fun, looking out for number one, different partner every night, so narcotic, out of sight." Brian Molko used his androgynous presentation as a political tool to provoke his audience to think critically about sexuality and gender identity. I wanted to challenge the homophobia that I was witnessing in the music scene. I wanted anybody who was slightly homophobic to show up at our gigs and think, oh, I really fancy the singer, she's hot, only to find out later that the singer was called Brian, which would later hopefully lead to them going home and asking themselves a few questions. But this didn't come without consequence. Molko was often slighted in the press and mocked for his gender-fluid image. They even came after his analytical thinking and his willingness to be vulnerable and open about his identity in interviews. Everybody reacted to me as sort of Brett Anderson number 2. Nobody really actually did believe me, basically. And people still think it's this little ploy I invented in order to get girls. And maybe one of the reasons why it hasn't registered with people is that they didn't want it to be true. Which is why whenever the subject is approached now in interviews, one of the first things I lay down on the table is, this is the way it is. I'm bi. Like it or leave it. Luckily, the scrutiny was never enough to keep him down. He stood his ground and was well equipped to handle these cheap swipes from the press, always conducting himself with grace and poise in interviews.
And, I think it's important to write songs that not necessarily from one specific gender's point of view or one sexuality specific's point of view. That kind of ambiguity allows it to be relatable to everybody, and each individual that hears the song and relates to it can live their own story through that song. And I think that's why the music becomes really important to people and why they treasure it, because it has that openness to it. It's not gender specific, it's not sexuality specific,
This unapologetic embrasure of his sexuality, as well as his knack for dressing up, were natural extensions of who he was, but that didn't stop the media from continuing to make cheap swipes at him. They want me to be a person who's using ambiguous sexuality or bisexuality as an excuse to get They want me to be that person. As I said in my Dorian Electra video, this all goes back to what Helena Schugert wrote about the image of the metrosexual man. That the trend of metrosexuality, the metrosexual moment, is appropriately apprehended as a rhetorical device in the service of re-establishing commercial masculinity. In other words, the general public and the media are completely fine with androgyny as long as it is predicated on the erosion of queerness and the eradication of women. Brian Molko subverted this simply by existing and occupying that space as a bisexual man who transgressed normative social roles with his gender-fluid presentation, also crediting many of the queer men who occupied the space before him and made it possible for him to do so, like Michael Stipe, David Bowie, and Brett Anderson from Suede, to name a few. Placebo wasn't exactly a band that was for everyone, and they were fine with that. They've described themselves over the years as a band for the outcasts, the misfits, and the square pegs in the round holes. I'd rather we were considered a Marmite band than for us to be seen as inoffensive and easily forgettable, so I don't have a problem with generating love or disgust for our band. That's not an issue for me at all. And they have inspired quite a few legendary bands that followed in their path, whom you may have heard of.
Placebo is one of my favorite bands of all time. We're on tour with them right now.
It's still difficult for a lot of people to wrap their brains around the idea that bisexual men exist. And to a similar end, there has been no shortage of insults hurled at Molko in the press, from his behavior earlier in his career, to his singing voice, his penchant for black nail polish, or the constant prodding into his love life based on his appearance, only for the targeted harassment to continue after he finally came out. But he didn't let that dampen his spirit, nor touch his legacy. In fact, I would argue that all the coverage actually helped his career, and he will always be relevant for the emotionally wrought, unabashedly hedonistic and vulnerable songwriting that he put out into the world.